Do you know who I am? Exec confronts black judge, career over. The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of the Hennepin County Courthouse in Minneapolis, casting long shadows across the polished marble floors. Judge Quinton Braverman adjusted his robe as he prepared for another day on the bench, unaware that this particular Thursday would test everything he had built over 15 years of judicial service. At 32, Quinton had become one of the youngest district court judges in Minnesota history, an achievement that came with its own set of challenges and scrutiny. His chambers were modest, lined with law books and framed citations, but the weight of responsibility felt heavier than any physical burden. Quinton had grown up in North Minneapolis, in a neighborhood where police sirens were the soundtrack of childhood, and opportunity felt like a distant dream. His mother, Lorraine, had worked double shifts as a nurse, while his father disappeared before Quinton's 5th birthday. The path from those streets to this courtroom had been paved with scholarships, sleepless nights, and an unwavering belief that the justice system could be better than what he had witnessed growing up. He remembered the public defender who had fought for his cousin Jerome, the only adult who had treated their family with dignity during the darkest time. That memory became his compass. The cases on today's docket ranged from minor traffic violations to a preliminary hearing for an assault charge. Quinton reviewed each file with meticulous attention, knowing that behind every case number was a human story, a family affected, a life potentially changed. His approach had earned him respect from most attorneys who appeared before him, though some struggled with a black judge who refused to be predictable or deferential to their expectations. He had learned to read the subtle shifts in body language, the coded language some lawyers used, the assumptions they made before he even spoke. Outside the courtroom, the typical morning chaos unfolded. Attorneys huddled with clients, bailiffs checked security protocols, and court reporters prepared their equipment. Quinton emerged from his chambers, greeting his bailiff, Raymond Chen, with a brief nod. Raymond had worked court security for 12 years and had seen judges come and go, but he appreciated Quinton's consistency and fairness. The gallery began filling with people, some nervous, some resigned, all waiting for their moment before the bench. All rise. The Hennepin County District Court is now in session. The Honorable Judge Quinton Braverman presiding, Raymond announced, his voice carrying the practiced authority of someone who had delivered these words thousands of times. Quinton took his seat, scanning the courtroom with the calm presence that had become his trademark. The morning proceeded smoothly through several cases until the bailiff called the matter of Whitman versus Whitman, a contentious divorce proceeding that had already consumed 6 months of court time. As the parties assembled at their respective tables, Quinton noticed the tension immediately. The opposing counsel, Gerald Whitman, carried himself with an aggressive confidence that bordered on arrogance. "Your Honor, before we proceed, I need to address a serious concern about judicial impartiality in this matter," Gerald began, his voice sharp and confrontational. "My client, Ms. Hadley Whitman, has expressed doubts about receiving fair treatment in this courtroom." Quinton maintained his composure, though he recognized the opening move of a strategy designed to unsettle. "Mr. Whitman, if you have a legitimate concern about impartiality, there are proper procedures for recusal requests. I suggest you follow them rather than making vague insinuations on the record." "This isn't vague, Your Honor," Gerald pressed forward, emboldened by his own rhetoric. "My client is a prominent business executive who has contributed significantly to this community. She deserves a judge who understands the complexities of high-net-worth divorce proceedings, not someone who might harbor resentment toward successful individuals." The courtroom fell silent. Several attorneys in the gallery exchanged uncomfortable glances, recognizing the coded language for what it was. Quinton leaned forward slightly, his expression unchanged, but his eyes sharpening with focus. "Mr. Whitman, I've presided over hundreds of divorce cases involving parties of various economic backgrounds. My decisions are based on Minnesota family law, not on any party's bank account or my alleged feelings about their success. If you're questioning my qualifications, I graduated top of my class from the University of Minnesota Law School, clerked for a federal appellate judge, and have been affirmed on appeal in 93% of my cases. Now, do you have a legitimate legal argument to present, or are we finished with this performance?" Gerald's face flushed, but he wasn't backing down. With all due respect, Your Honor, qualifications on paper don't necessarily translate to understanding the nuances of cases like this. My client worked her entire life to build her company. She's concerned about judicial bias based on, shall we say, different life experiences and perspectives. Different perspectives, Quinton repeated, his tone remaining professional, though everyone in the courtroom understood the subtext. Mr. Whitman, if you're implying what I believe you're implying, I strongly suggest you reconsider your approach. This is a court of law, and I expect counsel to conduct themselves accordingly. The atmosphere in the courtroom had transformed from routine proceedings to electric tension. Hadley Whitman sat at the plaintiff's table, a striking woman in her early 50s with golden hair styled in an immaculate bob and piercing blue eyes that surveyed the room with calculating precision. Her tailored navy suit probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, and she wore her wealth like armor. She leaned toward her attorney, whispering something that caused Gerald to nod with renewed determination. At the defendant's table, her soon-to-be ex-husband Marcus Whitman sat with his attorney, looking uncomfortable with the direction the hearing had taken. The gallery had filled considerably, word having spread through the courthouse that something unusual was happening in Judge Braverman's courtroom. Young law clerks stood in the back, sensing they were witnessing a moment that would be discussed in hushed tones later. The court reporter's fingers flew across her stenography machine, capturing every word for the official record. Quinton's judicial assistant, seated at a desk near the bench, kept her eyes fixed on her computer screen, though her rigid posture betrayed her awareness of the escalating conflict. Raymond, the bailiff, had positioned himself slightly closer to the bench than usual, his hand resting near his radio. He had seen enough courtroom drama to recognize when a situation might require intervention. The morning light streaming through the windows seemed harsher now, illuminating the battle lines being drawn in real time. Quinton had faced subtle discrimination throughout his career, the kind that came wrapped in professional language and plausible deniability. But Gerald Whitman's approach was pushing boundaries that most attorneys knew better than to cross. The judge took a measured breath, aware that his response would set the tone not just for this case, but for his authority in this courtroom going forward. He had learned from mentors that maintaining judicial composure didn't mean accepting disrespect, and that sometimes the most powerful response was clarity rather than anger. Mr. Whitman, I'm going to ask you one direct question, and I expect a direct answer, Quinton said, his voice steady and firm. Are you challenging my ability to preside over this case based on my race? The question hung in the air like a thunderclap. Gerald opened his mouth, then closed it, clearly calculating his next move. Hadley Whitman's blue eyes narrowed as she watched the judge, her expression a mixture of defiance and assessment. She had built a pharmaceutical distribution company from the ground up, fighting in boardrooms dominated by men, and she wasn't accustomed to being challenged by anyone, especially not by someone she viewed as beneath her station. Your Honor, I'm simply advocating for my client's concerns about impartiality, Gerald finally responded, his tone attempting to sound reasonable. She has the right to question whether any judge, regardless of background, can set aside personal biases in cases involving significant wealth disparity. That's not what you said, Counselor, Quinton replied. You specifically referenced different life experiences and perspectives after questioning whether I could understand your client's position. Let me be absolutely clear. I grew up in North Minneapolis, yes. I'm African American, yes. I also have a Juris Doctorate, 15 years of legal experience, and I've been entrusted by the voters of this county to administer justice fairly. If you believe my background disqualifies me, file a formal recusal motion with specific legal grounds. Otherwise, we're moving forward with this hearing. Hadley Whitman suddenly stood, her chair scraping against the floor with a sharp sound that drew everyone's attention. Your Honor, may I address the court directly? Quinton's eyes moved to her attorney, who looked simultaneously horrified and resigned. Miss Whitman, you're represented by counsel. Any statements should come through Mr. Whitman. I'm paying him $300 an hour to represent my interests, and I think I should be able to speak for myself, Hadley said, her voice carrying the command of someone used to being obeyed. I've built Whitman Pharmaceutical Distribution into a $120 million company. I employ over 300 people. I've donated millions to this city's hospitals, museums, and schools. I deserve a judge who respects what I've accomplished, not someone who sees me as just another privileged white woman to take down a peg." The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Quinton raised his hand for silence, and the room gradually quieted. "Ms. Whitman, sit down. You're out of order." "Am I?" Hadley's voice rose, her composure cracking to reveal the rage beneath. "I pay more in taxes in 1 year than most people earn in a lifetime. I've created jobs. I've contributed to this community. And I won't be lectured about fairness by someone who probably got his position through diversity quotas and affirmative action rather than actual merit." The words landed like physical blows. Several people in the gallery gasped. Marcus Whitman dropped his head into his hands. Gerald looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor, but Quinton remained perfectly still, his face an impassive mask even as the insult reverberated through the courtroom. "Ms. Whitman." "You are in contempt of court," Quinton said, his voice cutting through the chaos with quiet authority. "Bailiff, please escort Ms. Whitman to holding while I consider sanctions. Mr. Whitman, your client's behavior has terminated today's hearing. We'll reconvene when she's prepared to show this court the respect it deserves." "You can't do this," Hadley shouted as Raymond approached. "Do you know who I am? Do you have any idea who you're dealing with? I have connections in this city that go all the way to the governor's office. I'll have your robe before the end of the week." Raymond gently but firmly took Hadley's arm, guiding her toward the exit as she continued to protest. The other bailiff in the room had moved to assist, recognizing that the situation required careful handling. Hadley's golden hair had come slightly loose from its styled perfection, and her blue eyes blazed with fury as she was led away. Her expensive heels clicked against the marble floor, each step echoing her indignation. The courtroom remained in stunned silence, even after the door closed behind her, the shock of what they had witnessed settling over everyone like a heavy blanket. How did this story impact you? If you believe in fighting prejudice together, type Unity Wins. Share your thoughts. Remember to subscribe to Racism Root for more transformative stories that inspire change. After clearing the courtroom and calling a 30-minute recess, Quinton retreated to his chambers, finally allowing himself to process what had just occurred. His hands trembled slightly as he removed his robe, hanging it carefully on the wooden stand by his desk. 15 years of professional discipline had kept his composure intact in the courtroom. But alone in his chambers, the weight of Hadley Whitman's words pressed down on him. The suggestion that his accomplishments were illegitimate, that his position was unearned, echoed accusations he had heard in various forms throughout his career. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. "Come in," he called, expecting Raymond or his judicial assistant. Instead, Judge Patricia Morrison entered, carrying 2 cups of coffee. Patricia was a white woman in her mid-60s, with silver hair and kind eyes, a veteran of the bench who had presided over criminal cases for 23 years. She set 1 cup on Quinton's desk and settled into the chair across from him without waiting for an invitation. "I was in the hallway when word spread about what happened," Patricia said quietly. "Quinton, I want you to know that what Hadley Whitman said was not only contemptuous but completely false. You're one of the finest judges in this courthouse, and everyone who matters knows it." Quinton managed a slight smile. "Thank you, Patricia. Though I suspect Ms. Whitman's sentiment is shared by more people than would ever say it out loud." Patricia took a sip of her coffee, her expression turning thoughtful. "You're probably right. And that's why what you did in there matters so much. I've been on the bench for over 2 decades, and I've seen talented attorneys and judges of color have their credentials questioned in ways that would never happen to someone who looks like me. I'm ashamed to say I didn't always speak up when I should have. Why are you telling me this?" Quinton asked, genuine curiosity in his voice. Patricia set down her cup, meeting his eyes directly. "Because 10 years ago, I sat on a judicial review panel that considered your application for the bench. There were 3 people on that panel who voted against recommending you, and their reasoning had nothing to do with your qualifications. They said things like, too young, lacks temperament, needs more seasoning. But what they meant was that they weren't comfortable with a black man from North Minneapolis having that kind of authority. I voted for you, but I didn't fight hard enough against their objections. You got the position anyway because your record was undeniable, but I've regretted my silence ever since." The revelation surprised Quinton. He had never known the details of his confirmation process, only that it had taken longer than expected. "I appreciate you sharing that, Patricia." "Don't thank me yet," she replied with a slight smile, "because I'm here to tell you that Hadley Whitman is going to make good on her threats. She sits on the board of 3 major non-profit organizations in this city. She's a major campaign donor, and her company has contracts with half the hospitals in the state. She's going to use every connection she has to come after you. And when she does, I'm going to be one of several judges who will publicly support you and call out exactly what this is. A powerful person who can't accept that the law applies to her too." The afternoon sun had shifted, casting different patterns across Quinton's chambers. Patricia's presence brought an unexpected comfort, a reminder that allies existed even in unexpected places. Her silver hair caught the light as she stood to leave, and Quinton noticed for the first time the collection of citations on her wall, including several commendations for fair treatment of defendants from public defender organizations. She had fought her own battles for justice, just from a different position. The coffee she had brought remained warm in his hands, a small gesture that felt monumental in its timing and sincerity. By the following morning, Hadley Whitman had made bail on the contempt charge and immediately launched a media campaign. Local news outlets ran stories with headlines like "Business Leader Questions Judges," "Impartiality," and "Pharmaceutical Executive Held in Contempt After Courtroom Outburst." The coverage was carefully split between reporting the facts and allowing Hadley's PR team to shape the narrative. She appeared on a local morning show, her golden hair perfectly styled, blue eyes projecting wounded dignity, as she explained how she was simply advocating for fairness in a difficult divorce proceeding. Quinton watched the interview in his chambers before court, his stomach tightening as Hadley played the victim with practiced skill. "I may have spoken out of turn," she told the sympathetic host, "but when you feel like you're not being heard, sometimes emotion takes over. I've worked my entire life to build something meaningful, and I just wanted a judge who could understand the business complexities of my situation. Instead, I was treated like a criminal for expressing legitimate concerns." The host, a blonde woman named Savannah with a carefully neutral expression, asked the obvious follow-up question. "Ms. Whitman, Judge Braverman has an impressive legal record. What specific concerns did you have about his ability to handle your case?" Hadley's response was calculated. "I'm sure he's very qualified. I'm just saying that someone who grew up in very different circumstances might not fully grasp the nuances of protecting a business that took 30 years to build. That's not a criticism of him personally. It's just reality, what none of them knew." What Quinton had kept carefully private throughout his judicial career was the full story of how he had earned his way through law school. The scholarships had covered tuition, but living expenses required work. For 3 years, Quinton had worked the night shift at Whitman Pharmaceutical Distribution's warehouse, loading trucks and managing inventory while studying case law during his breaks. He had been employee number 47 when the company was still growing, working alongside immigrants and working-class families who needed those overnight shifts to survive. But there was more to the story, a piece that Quinton had never shared publicly because it involved someone else's pain. During his second year working at the warehouse, a 19-year-old named Darnell Jenkins had been injured when a forklift operator lost control and pinned Darnell against a wall. The injury left Darnell with permanent back damage and ended his dreams of military service. Whitman Pharmaceutical had offered a minimal settlement and threatened to fight any workers' compensation claim, arguing that Darnell had violated safety protocols. Quinton, who was in his second year of law school at the time, had spent hundreds of hours researching workers' compensation law, building a case, and ultimately representing Darnell in mediation. He had convinced the company to settle for enough money to cover Darnell's medical expenses and retraining for a different career. It had cost Quinton his job when Hadley found out he was the one advocating against her company, but Darnell had gotten justice. That case had taught Quinton more about the real-world application of law than any classroom lecture ever could. Now, as he watched Hadley paint herself as a misunderstood philanthropist on television, Quinton realized that she had no idea who he really was or where he had come from. She saw only what she wanted to see, a black judge who she assumed had received his position through programs designed to help minorities rather than through merit. The irony was almost laughable. He had literally worked in her warehouse, had seen firsthand how she treated the people who made her company profitable, had fought against her legal team to protect an injured worker. Quinton's judicial assistant, Vera, appeared at his door looking concerned. "Judge, there's someone here to see you." He says it's urgent and relates to the Whitman case. A man in his late 30s entered, moving with the careful gait of someone whose back had never fully healed. Darnell Jenkins had filled out since his teenage years, his face showing the lines of someone who had lived through hardship, but survived. He carried a folder under his arm and wore the uniform of a paralegal from one of the city's public interest law firms. "Judge Braverman," Darnell said, extending his hand. "I don't know if you remember me, but you changed my life 15 years ago. I saw the news about Hadley Whitman coming after you, and I thought you should know. You're not the first person she's tried to destroy for standing up to her, and there are a lot of us who remember." Word of Hadley Whitman's campaign against Judge Braverman spread quickly through Minneapolis's legal community and beyond. By Monday morning, the courthouse had become an unlikely battleground of public opinion. Supporters of the judge, including several attorneys who had appeared before him, began organizing. The Minnesota Association of Black Lawyers issued a statement condemning Hadley's comments and calling for an investigation into whether her outburst constituted racial bias. Community organizations from North Minneapolis, where Quinton had grown up, mobilized to defend one of their own who had made it to the bench. But Hadley wasn't backing down. She leveraged her position on the board of the Minneapolis Business Forum to circulate a letter among corporate leaders, suggesting that Judge Braverman's handling of her contempt charge demonstrated judicial overreach and bias against business interests. Several executives signed the letter, including 2 people Quinton had considered professional allies. The betrayal stung more than he wanted to admit. One of the signatories was Lawrence Henderson, a black businessman who ran a successful investment firm and had once praised Quinton at a charity dinner for being a role model for young professionals of color. The situation came to a head during a packed courthouse press conference that neither Quinton nor Hadley had organized. A coalition of community groups, led by Reverend Thomas Stillwater of Greater Grace Baptist Church, had called the media gathering to address what they called an attack on judicial integrity and racial justice. The courthouse steps were crowded with supporters holding signs reading, "Justice is blind, not biased, and respect the bench." Hadley arrived with her attorney Gerald and a small group of business leaders, clearly intending to counter the narrative. She positioned herself at the edge of the crowd, her golden hair catching the television camera lights, her blue eyes scanning the scene with calculated precision. The press sensed confrontation and turned their cameras to capture both sides of the growing conflict. Reverend Stillwater, a commanding presence with a voice honed by decades of preaching and activism, addressed the crowd and cameras. "We're here today because a qualified judge, a man who has served this community with distinction, is being attacked not for his decisions, but for his identity." Hadley Whitman stood in a court of law and suggested that Judge Quinton Braverman got his position through affirmative action rather than merit. That's not just disrespectful to Judge Braverman, it's disrespectful to every person of color who has worked twice as hard to achieve half the recognition. A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. But then Hadley stepped forward, her voice projecting with the confidence of someone accustomed to controlling rooms full of executives. "Reverend, with all due respect, you're mischaracterizing my concerns. I never said anything about Judge Braverman's race. I simply questioned whether any judge who grew up in poverty could fully understand the complexities of protecting a business empire." "That's about economics, not race. Then why did you specifically mention diversity quotas?" someone shouted from the crowd. Several people turned to see Darnell Jenkins, standing near the front with his paralegal credentials, visible on a lanyard around his neck. Hadley's composure flickered for just a moment before recovering. "I don't know who you are, but you're taking my words out of context." "I'm someone who knows exactly who you are," Darnell replied, his voice steady and clear. "I'm Darnell Jenkins. I worked at your warehouse 15 years ago, until a forklift accident nearly killed me because your company prioritized speed over safety." Judge Braverman, who was Quinton Braverman, a law student working the night shift to pay his way through school, spent hundreds of hours fighting your company to get me fair compensation. He lost his job because he stood up for me, and now you have the audacity to question his qualifications. The revelation sent shockwaves through the crowd. Reporters immediately began shouting questions. Hadley's face went pale, then flushed red as she realized the implications. Patricia Morrison, who had been standing quietly at the edge of the gathering, stepped forward to join Darnell. "I'm Judge Patricia Morrison," she announced. "I've served on the bench for 23 years. Judge Braverman is one of the most thorough, fair, and qualified jurists I've ever worked with. What we're witnessing here is a powerful person who can't accept being held accountable, trying to destroy a good man's reputation rather than accepting responsibility for her own contemptuous behavior." More voices joined in support. Attorney after attorney stepped forward, including several who practiced corporate law, to attest to Quinton's fairness and legal acumen. But the most surprising voice came from Marcus Whitman, Hadley's soon-to-be ex-husband, who had been standing in the back of the crowd. "I need to say something," Marcus called out, his voice shaking slightly. "I've been married to Hadley for 28 years, and I've watched her treat people like they're beneath her whenever they can't do something for her. She's going after Judge Braverman because he's the first person in years who wouldn't be intimidated by her money or her connections. This isn't about fair treatment. This is about her ego. How did this story impact you? If you believe in fighting prejudice together, type Unity Wins, share your thoughts. Remember to subscribe to Racism Root for more transformative stories that inspire change." The press conference ended in chaos, with reporters scrambling to verify the new information and Hadley Whitman retreating to a waiting car with her attorney. But the story was far from over. That evening, multiple news outlets began running deeper investigations into both Judge Braverman's background and Hadley's business practices. What they discovered painted a very different picture than the one Hadley had been promoting. Quinton's record at law school wasn't just impressive, it was extraordinary. He had graduated summa cum laude, while working full-time, and had published 2 law review articles that were still cited in labor law cases. His clerkship with federal appellate judge Margaret Thornton had been so successful that she had written him a recommendation letter calling him one of the finest legal minds I've encountered in 30 years on the bench. His appointment to the district court had been unanimous among the judicial selection committee once they reviewed his qualifications, despite the initial hesitation Patricia Morrison had mentioned. But the real revelation came from investigative reporters who started looking into Whitman Pharmaceutical Distribution's labor practices. They uncovered a pattern of workplace safety violations, discrimination complaints that had been quietly settled, and testimony from former employees describing a corporate culture where workers were treated as expendable. Several employees came forward to describe how Hadley would tour the warehouse facilities, but never learn workers' names, referring to them as the staff or the help, while treating salaried managers with warmth and respect. The story reached a tipping point when Minnesota's Department of Labor announced it was reopening investigations into several workplace injury claims at Whitman Pharmaceutical that had been settled under terms that included non-disclosure agreements. The state attorney general issued a statement saying that any attempt by Hadley Whitman to intimidate or retaliate against a sitting judge would be viewed as potential obstruction of justice and could result in criminal charges beyond the contempt issue already pending. The final blow came from an unexpected source. The Minneapolis Business Forum, the same organization that had circulated Hadley's letter criticizing Judge Braverman, held an emergency meeting and voted to remove her from their board. Lawrence Henderson, the businessman whose signature on the original letter had stung Quinton, called a press conference to explain his change of position. "I made a mistake," Lawrence said, facing the cameras with visible discomfort. "When Hadley Whitman approached me with concerns about judicial overreach, I signed that letter because I've had my own frustrations with how the court system sometimes treats business owners. But I didn't have all the facts. I didn't know that Judge Braverman had literally worked in her warehouse, that he had fought for worker safety, that his credentials were beyond question. I let my own biases about the judicial system blind me to what was really happening. a powerful person trying to avoid accountability by attacking a black judge's legitimacy. I was wrong, and I apologized to Judge Braverman publicly. The contempt hearing was rescheduled for the following week, and this time the courtroom was packed with observers, including several other judges who had come to show solidarity. Hadley Whitman appeared without Gerald, having hired new counsel who clearly understood the gravity of the situation. Her new attorney, a respected litigator named Sharon Reeves, approached the bench with obvious contrition. "Your Honor, my client wishes to address the court," Sharon said quietly. Quinton nodded, his expression neutral but attentive. Hadley stood, and for the first time since this entire situation began, she looked genuinely humbled. The expensive suit was replaced with something more modest, and her demeanor lacked the arrogance that had characterized her previous appearance. "Judge Braverman, I owe you an apology," Hadley began, her voice lacking its previous command. "I said things in this courtroom that were not only contemptuous, but deeply offensive and rooted in prejudice that I didn't even recognize in myself. I assumed that because you came from North Minneapolis, because of your race, that you couldn't possibly understand my situation. I was completely wrong. After everything that's come to light, I know now that you understood my business better than I wanted to admit, because you actually worked there, actually saw how it operated from the ground level. I am ashamed of my behavior, and I accept whatever consequences this court deems appropriate." The courtroom remained silent as Hadley finished speaking. Quinton took a moment before responding, aware that every word would be scrutinized and remembered. The afternoon light filtered through the high windows, illuminating the seal of Minnesota behind the bench, a reminder of the authority vested not in individuals, but in the institution of law itself. Hadley's blue eyes, previously so defiant, now reflected something closer to understanding, or perhaps just the recognition of consequences. Patricia Morrison sat in the gallery, her presence a quiet endorsement. Darnell Jenkins was there too, representing the workers whose voices had finally been heard. The transformation from confrontation to accountability hung in the air like a bridge, being built in real time. Quinton sentenced Hadley Whitman to 30 days of community service at a legal aid clinic serving low-income clients, along with a formal public apology and a substantial fine that would be donated to organizations supporting workplace safety advocacy. It was a measured response that held her accountable while offering a path toward growth. The sentence received widespread approval from legal experts who noted that it balanced punishment with the opportunity for genuine rehabilitation. The weeks that followed saw unexpected developments. Hadley began her community service at the Legal Rights Center in North Minneapolis, the same neighborhood where Quinton had grown up. She was assigned to work with paralegals helping clients navigate workplace injury claims, essentially seeing from the other side what workers experienced when trying to get fair treatment from corporations. The experience was humbling in ways she hadn't anticipated. She met parents working multiple jobs to support their families, immigrants who didn't understand the legal system, people who had been injured at work and didn't know they had rights. One afternoon, Hadley found herself working on a case that involved a warehouse worker injured in circumstances remarkably similar to what Darnell had experienced 15 years earlier. The young woman, Sofia Gutierrez, had been told by her employer that she couldn't file for workers' compensation because she was technically an independent contractor, even though she worked full-time at their facility. As Hadley reviewed the case file, she saw clearly how companies used legal technicalities to avoid responsibility, and she recognized her own company's tactics in the employer's arguments. Near the end of her community service, Hadley requested a meeting with Quinton through proper channels. They met in his chambers, with Patricia Morrison present as an observer to ensure propriety. Hadley looked different, not just in her more modest attire, but in her entire demeanor. The arrogance had been replaced with something that resembled genuine reflection. "Judge Braverman, I wanted to thank you," Hadley said, the words clearly difficult but sincere. "You could have thrown the book at me and I would have deserved it. Instead, you gave me an education. Working at that legal aid clinic showed me how many people struggle against systems that I've always been able to navigate easily. I saw myself in those corporate lawyers who were fighting against workers' claims, and I didn't like what I saw." Quinton listened carefully before responding. "Ms. Whitman, Accountability isn't just about punishment. It's about understanding impact and changing behavior. I hope you'll take what you've learned and apply it to how your company treats workers going forward. I already am, Hadley replied. I've hired an independent firm to audit our workplace safety practices, and we're implementing changes. I'm also setting up a fund for employees who need legal assistance with any work-related issues. It won't undo the past, but maybe it can prevent some future harm. Patricia Morrison spoke up for the first time. Hadley, what you said in that courtroom did real damage, not just to Judge Braverman, but to the principle that judges should be evaluated on their merit, not their background. I hope you understand that. I do, Hadley said quietly, and I'm sorry to you too. Judge Morrison, for making you witness that, and for putting Judge Braverman in a position where he had to defend credentials that should have never been questioned in the first place. The meeting ended with an understanding that felt fragile but genuine. As Hadley left, Quentin reflected on the strange journey that had brought them both to this point. The confrontation had been painful, but it had also revealed truths that needed to be spoken. The legal community had been forced to confront uncomfortable questions about implicit bias and how assumptions about people's backgrounds affected their treatment in professional spaces. Several law schools had reached out to Quentin, asking him to speak about his experience, wanting to use it as a teaching moment for future attorneys and judges. The healing wasn't just personal, it rippled through institutions. The Minnesota Judicial Council implemented new training protocols for addressing courtroom bias and protecting judicial independence from intimidation. Whitman Pharmaceutical became a case study in how companies could transform their workplace cultures when leadership genuinely committed to change. Darnell Jenkins was promoted to senior paralegal at his firm, his story of standing up for justice inspiring other young legal professionals. 6 months after the confrontation that had nearly ended his career, Quentin stood before a gathering of first-year law students at the University of Minnesota. He had been invited to speak about the pathway from North Minneapolis to the bench and about resilience in the face of adversity. The auditorium was packed with eager faces representing every background imaginable. Young people who had chosen law because they believed in justice, even when the system seemed imperfect. The night I worked my last shift at Whitman Pharmaceuticals warehouse, after I'd been fired for helping Darnell Jenkins, I sat in my car wondering if I'd made the right choice, Quentin told them. I was broke, I'd lost my income, and I had 2 more years of law school ahead of me. But I knew that if I couldn't stand up for someone being treated unjustly when I had the knowledge and ability to help, then what was the point of all this legal education? That night taught me that the law isn't just what you know. It's what you do with that knowledge. The students listened with rapt attention as Quentin shared his journey, not glossing over the difficult moments or the times he had doubted himself. He talked about the subtle discrimination he had faced, the assumptions people made, the extra scrutiny that came with being a young black judge. But he also talked about the allies who had emerged, like Patricia Morrison, and the community support that had sustained him through the recent crisis. What happened with Hadley Whitman wasn't just about one case or one person's prejudice, Quentin continued. It was about a system that still struggles with the idea that authority and expertise can come from unexpected places, from people who don't fit traditional molds. Every single one of you will face moments when someone questions whether you belong, whether you earned your position, whether you're qualified to sit at the table. Your response to those moments will define not just your career, but the kind of legal system we build together. After the speech, a young black woman approached Quentin, her eyes bright with determination. Judge Braverman, I'm from North Minneapolis too. My mom is a nurse just like your mom was. Seeing what you've accomplished, and knowing you came from where I come from, it makes it feel possible. Quentin smiled, remembering his own journey and the people who had made him believe it was possible. What's your name? Imani. Imani Russell. Well, Imani, the legal profession needs people like you, people who understand what justice really means, because they've seen injustice up close. Don't ever let anyone make you feel like your background is a weakness. It's your greatest strength. The sun was setting over Minneapolis as Quentin drove through North Minneapolis on his way home, passing the streets where he had grown up. The neighborhood hadn't changed much, still struggling with many of the same challenges, but there were also signs of hope. new community centers, youth programs, small businesses opening. He thought about the young people like Imani who would come after him, and about the responsibility he carried to make the path a little easier for them. His phone buzzed with a text from Patricia Morrison. Just heard from the Judicial Council. They want us both on the new Bias Prevention Committee. Looks like we've got more work to do. Quentin smiled as he replied, "Wouldn't have it any other way." The legacy of that difficult Thursday morning would extend far beyond one contempt case or one judge's vindication. It had sparked conversations in law schools, courtrooms, and corporate boardrooms across the state about implicit bias, about who gets to hold power, and about what true accountability looks like. Hadley Whitman's company had become a model for workplace reform, hosting other business leaders who wanted to learn how to create more equitable practices. The confrontation that could have destroyed Quentin's career had instead become a catalyst for systemic change. As darkness fell over the city, lights began flickering on in homes and offices, each one representing lives being lived, challenges being faced, and justice being sought. Quentin Braverman would return to the bench Monday morning, ready to continue the work that had always driven him, ensuring that everyone who entered his courtroom, regardless of their background or bank account, received equal treatment under the law. The robe he wore represented not just his personal achievement, but the possibilities available to anyone willing to fight for justice, even when the system seemed designed to keep them out. The story of "Do You Know Who I Am" had become a story about something deeper. The recognition that true authority comes not from wealth or connections or assumptions about who belongs in positions of power, but from competence, integrity, and the courage to stand for what's right even when it costs you something. And that lesson would echo through generations of legal professionals who learned that the most important question isn't "Do you know who I am?" but "Do I know who I'm meant to be?" How did this story impact you? If you believe in fighting prejudice together, type "Unity Wins." Share your thoughts. Remember to subscribe to Racism Root for more transformative stories that inspire change.